Hey, we're glad that you are here with us this morning. We have been in this series called Engage the last few weeks, and we're going to wrap up this series today. Actually, I take that back. We're technically wrapping up this series this week, but we're going to add one sermon on to the end of this next week too. And so even though this is the final week of this kind of 5 parts of how to engage as a member of a church, I know sometimes there's questions that pop up from people about some of the very basic things that we do. Things like communion, things like baptism, things like why we sing and all this. So next week, we're going to take a step way back, and we're just going to kind of look at Church 101. So if you've been coming for a while, you're curious about why we do what we do, come next week, because we're going to kind of tack on something to this Engage series. It's going to be a little bit different in the way we approach it, but make sure you're here for that as well, too, because we've been talking these last few weeks about, again, what it means to follow Jesus and be a member of a church. But for some of you, the concept of church itself is fairly new. So don't miss that if you can come and join us. But we've been the last 4 weeks talking about these points of engagement, these steps, if you will. Sometimes you hear me talk about taking a next step, and that's what these are. And if you've missed any of them, I would really encourage you to go listen to them on our website or our podcast and check these out, because these are important things. Again, these aren't an exhaustive list of what it means to be a Christian, but these are very important steps that we all need to be taking. Today we're going to wrap this up. You can see there on the screen what the 5th step is. I don't have to really elaborate too much, but we're talking about giving, and I like to say that because it's kind of fun to watch some of you cringe when I say that. But it's a topic that we don't talk about that often. Some churches talk about it too often, but it's a topic that kind of makes everybody a little bit uneasy. So let me say this: if you're a visitor, if you're kind of new, you're kind of figuring this whole concept out, you kind of get to sit back and watch all of the church people squirm a little bit today. It's always kind of fun, because I'm really talking more to those folks today. But if you are a visitor, you kind of get a concept of where we are coming from with this topic. But before we kind of get into that, I kind of want to ask you a question. Those of you who are parents in the room, when you have worked with your kids, you've taught your kids, you've taught other people, maybe not even kids, but other people. I know some of you are teachers, some of you work with students. How do you notice how your kids, how your students learn? For example, they listen to what you say and they can figure it out like that? They have to see it, they have to feel it, touch it, do it themselves. I know I can speak for myself. I'm more of a visual learner. You can tell me exactly how to do a project, but me watching you do it, I'll learn it much better. I'm not a huge handyman, but the stuff I've learned with woodworking, with maybe tiling a floor, I just learned by watching my dad do it, or learned by watching my grandpa do it. I'm this kind of, again, visual in that way. My oldest daughter is the same way. It drives me crazy, because no matter what I tell her, it doesn't work. She has to watch me do it. She's doing math right now and learning how to add and subtract bigger numbers, and it's frustrating for me as a parent to try and help her with this, because for me, math was very easy. I was one of those, I'm not trying to brag, but as a student, I'd get in trouble because I didn't ever write my work down on my paper. I just wrote the answer down because I could figure it in my head. And Elsie's one that it's not quite clicking as fast. And I'm like, how do you not know this? I forget she's in 2nd grade, but that's beside the point, right? So we have to work with ideas for her and put out like coins on the table, like, okay, there's 15 coins, it's 15 minus 7, take 7 away. This should be common sense. But she sees me do it and she picks up on it. Visual learner. And what you kind of understand with kids, especially if your kids are a lot like you, what you understand is this concept that as a parent, if you can get your kid, to see the end result, they'll have an easier time doing it. Again, we can explain our kids why they should do certain things. And parents, let's be honest, how many times have we exhausted ourselves telling our kids what to do, but they don't see the end result like we do? We've been there. We've got kind of a bird's eye view of it, right? We know what it's going to take to get them there. Working with Elsie this past summer on how to hit a baseball. I could see the end result. She couldn't. So if I could get her to see what I wanted her to see, she was going to have an easier time figuring this out. Here's where I'm going with this morning. It's this concept that I want you to understand as a member of a church. And it's this concept right here. If you could see the world the way God sees it, you'd be more likely to do what he wants to do in it. If you could see the world the way God sees it, it would be more likely to do what he wants done in it. But think about this for a second. How do we see the world? We see the world through our own perspective, right? And that perspective has been skewed by what we believe in our worldview, whether that is politics or where you're from or the family you grew up in or the country you grew up in. That's going to change how you see the world. Despite our best efforts, even as Christians, even as members of a church, we sometimes can't see the world the same way God sees it. Okay, we've got this kind of twist on it a little bit. So if we can see the world the way God sees it, we would be more likely to do what he wants in it. And more specifically, we would be more likely to understand how he feels about his creation, about his humanity that he's created, about his plan to save that humanity. Because here's kind of the big picture thing I want you to understand today, even more than this statement is this: the local church is the hope of the world. Okay? Now, you can say, no, Jesus is the hope of the world. Yeah, true. But guess what Jesus did right before he went to heaven? He gave the church his job, and then he went to heaven. So we're the continuation of what he was doing. He gave us 3 commissioning statements. You can read them in John 20 and Matthew 28 and Acts 1. All of them basically said, hey, everything I've been doing, it's your turn now. You do it. So the hope of the world is the local church. Now, when I say local church, understand what I mean. I don't just mean Redwood Christian Church. I mean every single church across this town, across this state, across this country, across the world. Right now, churches are meeting all across this part of the country. Other parts of the country, they probably already let out for lunch. But all across the world, churches have met to do what? To worship God, to be challenged, to go out, to bring Jesus to the world. That is our hope. That is our goal. But think about what we do as people to put our hope into things. Think about who we put our hope into. Okay? Just think about these categories and think if you have ever put your hope in one of these. Maybe it's in politics or a certain leader. You put your hope into them. Oh, they've got the answers. They're going to fix everything. Maybe it's business or corporation. You know, you see what this one company's doing. Man, like, they're going to fix things. They're going to change the world. Maybe it's the media. Okay? Maybe it is education. I'm a big believer in education. I mean, I taught high school for several years. I've been in college pretty much nonstop for the last 15 years because I've got problems, right? You look at education, you go, man, that's the hope of the world. My wife's nodding and trying to make it look like she's not nodding, but she's nodding back there. Maybe it's nonprofit organizations. Maybe it's entertainment. Now, hear me out on this. Maybe for you it's entertainment. It's the arts or, movies or TV or sports. You may think, no. I said last night, surrounded by 55,000 people who put a lot of hope into a football team that wears random colors on Saturdays. And you don't believe me, when the first half wasn't going very well and they were turning the ball over left and right, those people that were screaming things at the field, it was obvious they had some hope riding in that game. As a sports fan, I can understand because Friday afternoon, if I'm being very honest, when my Cardinals were swinging and missing at every curveball in the dirt in the 9th inning, losing 3-0 in Game 2, I was not happy. So think about it. I don't need a show of hands, but how many of you have ever put hope into someone or something in one of those areas? Probably a lot of us have. Okay? Probably a lot of us have. Now, I want you to understand, none of those are a source of hope. They can be avenues or channels of hope, but none of them are actually the source of hope. Folks, there is one source of hope in the world ever, and that's Jesus. Plain and simple. Jesus is the only source of hope in our world. Now, it's my prayer, and it should be yours, that in all 6 of those areas I listed, we have people who are fervently following Jesus, who have understood he is the hope that are in those areas. I'd love to have politicians that are they are just hardcore Jesus followers. Just chasing after Jesus with everything they had. Same with business and education and nonprofits. And man, I love it too when you see some celebrity who's got influence, who is a follower of Jesus, bringing Jesus into the world. But all throughout the Bible, when we read this, the hope of the world is Jesus. And how is that manifested out through the New Testament, through our world today, through the church? The church is the continuation of what Jesus started. And we know this because Jesus is the one who started the church. It wasn't the apostles, it was Jesus. Matthew Chapter 16, he says it. He says, I will build my church. And what? The powers of hell will not conquer it. You've probably heard this verse a lot. If you're a Christian, I've heard this verse my whole life. I don't know if I've ever really stepped back and understood just how powerful of a verse this is. How powerful of a statement this was by Jesus. I will build my church. I'm not going to build yours. I'm building my church, and I'm going to build it, Jesus says. Okay? Some people think the church was man-made. I mean, Jesus made it, yeah. The rest of us didn't. We might have built these buildings. Okay, we might have come up with an order of a service, but Jesus built his church, and that second part of that, man, the powers of hell will not conquer it. Think about this for a second. How many of you can think about some empire, whether this was some physical, political empire, or some like major corporation, or something that at one point in time just seemed insurmountable, like nothing would ever beat it, nothing could ever bring it down, and now it no longer exists? I mean, you can read a history book and see all the major empires that ruled the world at one point in time. Don't exist anymore. Or think about a corporation that maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago was worth billions of dollars, could basically run the world, and now it's an afterthought. Or maybe there's corporations today that are out there, maybe like an Amazon or a Google or one of those that are just running the world. One of these days, they're not going to exist anymore. You want to know the one empire that's never, ever failed or faltered? It's the church. And maybe the church gets run out of one part of the world. Guess what it does? It just goes somewhere else and thrives there. It's easy to look around our country today and see that we're kind of moving into this post-Christian society and think, man, the church is in trouble. The church has never been stronger. Maybe it's not doing as well here in the U.S., but you look over in China where it's illegal, hundreds of millions of people are coming to Jesus. You think about Africa working across that entire continent, billions of people. The church is thriving. The church is growing, and the church will continue to thrive and grow until Jesus comes back because no power of hell can conquer it. So I want you to think about something for a second here. Because again, we're looking at the church as the hope of the world. We're looking at the local church specifically as the hope of the world. And you may say, well, how do we know? Just because Jesus said it, how do we know? The church means more to Jesus than you could possibly understand. Now, maybe you've got a good grasp on this already, and it still will blow your mind, because here's what the Bible says Jesus looks at the church as. In Ephesians chapter 5, we kind of see this list of things that Paul gives us, and it says how Jesus looks at the church. Specifically, he says this in verse 23. He says, Jesus is the head of the church. Okay? It doesn't matter who is the pastor of this church, if it's me or if it's somebody else. Okay? It doesn't matter if it's a denomination, who's the president of that denomination. None of that matters. Jesus is the head of the church. Period. Verse 25 says Jesus loves his church. Okay? And then you jump down to verse 33, and it says that Jesus, or verse 32, Jesus calls the church his bride. Think about this for a second, husbands. Think about how you view your wife. Okay? A good, godly husband, a good, godly leader, values his wife above all else. Now, you think about, in my life personally, outside of my relationship with Jesus, my wife is next. Ahead of my kids, ahead of you all, ahead of everybody else, the rest of my family. My wife is right there. Okay? And I've noticed this with the two of us. You can say anything you want to me that's critical. I can handle it. She can't. Somebody can say anything they want to her that's critical. She can handle it. I can't. Why? Because you're talking about my bride. You know, there's this idea that a lot of us say, well, we're willing to put down our lives for a friend. And to some degree, I think that might be talk. But I like to think that if she was threatened, I could jump in front of that bullet. Now, I say that, I've got to be honest with you, because about 15 years ago, we were shooting off fireworks at my cousin's house, right out in the road, about 15 feet in front of us, because we're brilliant. And one of them blew up in the tube, and I went diving behind my 85-year-old aunt. Just got to be honest about that, okay? Did what? Did you knock her down? No, she was in a lawn chair. I just dove underneath it. But I wasn't married at the time, so, that's changed, right? Perspectives change, right? A good husband, okay, a good family leader, hear this, you don't just defend your wife, you prioritize your wife. And not only that, here's what you do. You defend her, and it upsets you when somebody else doesn't hold her in high regard. That's why I'll get defensive of her, because somebody's not holding her in the same regard that I do. Jesus calls the church his bride. So think about this for just 1 second. How do you think it makes him feel when his people, his followers, don't hold his bride in the same regard he does? They don't prioritize her the way he does. They don't treasure her and value her the way he does. Think about that. Because that's what a lot of us do without realizing it. So I've got a question for you. You don't have to show hands, but I just want to ask you this question. I want you to think about this question. I want you to answer this honestly to yourself. When it comes to his bride, do you love her and treasure her and value her? And specifically, when it comes to the church you call your home church, and for most of you, this is Redwood Christian Church, do you love this church? Because if you do, here's a follow-up question for you. Do you have a plan to financially support the church you love? Do you have a plan? I want to say this off the top too. I know many of you do. I know that many of you do. Because many of you give regularly to this church. And again, I'm talking really specifically today to those who call this, you call this church your home. You call this church your family or your community. Okay? Do you have a plan? Because here's what I want to kind of get across to you today. I saw a statistic today that blows me away, or a statistic this past week that blows me away. 67% of church members don't have a plan to financially support the church that they call home. That number blew me away. Now, we're familiar with things like the 80-20 principle. Now, if you don't know what that means, 20% of the people do 80% of the work. That applies to pretty much any organization, any project, anything. And it applies to church giving, to be very honest. 20% of the people do 80% of the hard work, 80% of the lifting. And even with that 20%, 20% of those do 80%. It's just the way it works. That's kind of everything that you've ever been a part of. But in the church itself, 2/3 of its members don't have a plan. Now hear what I'm saying here. I'm not saying 2/3 of the church members don't give. I'm saying 2/3 of the church members don't have a plan to give. The bags come by, you might throw $5 or $10 in there, and that's awesome. But 2/3 of the church members, what this statistic is saying, have not factored it into their personal budgets to have a plan to financially support the church. I know many of you have that. You've set it up. In other words, when you have your monthly set of what you have to pay, your monthly budget, giving to the church is on there and often at the very top or near the top. Along with maybe your mortgage or a car payment or whatever it may be, electric bills. You've got tithing right up there at the top. But for some of you, it's you kind of throw in maybe what you've got left over. Or you throw in something here or there. And so here's kind of where I want to angle this a little bit today, because I want you to understand why this is important. I want you to understand why this is so important. And it's not just simply based on the numbers. Because if this 67% is true of us, think about what this means. 1/3 of you are supporting what we do right now. So imagine what could happen if we tripled that. Okay, just imagine that. But what I want to look at is how we can change this number so you can start thinking through this to why this should be a priority for you. And what I want you to do, what I want to do is kind of phrase this in three questions. Three questions that I want to ask you. I want you to think about. If you're taking notes, I want you to write these down and think about these over the course of this week. Here's the first question I want you to ask yourself. Has God blessed you? Has God blessed you? Most of you are going to say, yes, he has. Okay? Some of you are going to say, yeah, he did once, he's not right now. Okay? You're going to have answers like this, because here's what happens. Too often, we start looking at our current situation in life and use that as a gauge of how God has blessed or is blessing us. And when we do that, at first I want to say, it's very easy to do that, and I think we've all done it. It's easy to kind of look at a situation and go, man, things are just awful right now. Nothing's going my way, man, I can't catch a break, and it's easy to think that. But understand your current situation is never a gauge of how God has or is blessing you in your life. Because often when you're in your current situation, that's all you see is your current situation. You kind of use that old metaphor, you can't see the forest because of the trees. You're caught right in the middle of it. And it's easy to see, man, things are just awful. Seriously, I thought God was going to bless me, and he's not. But I want you to kind of ask these questions right now. Okay? Ask yourself, did I wake up in a bed this morning in a home that's climate controlled? Did I take a shower last night or this morning with warm running water? Okay, did I have a light switch that worked? Did I get in the car and drive here this morning? Okay, those are simple questions, and I'm not trying to belittle a rough situation. Okay, I'm really not. But sometimes God is blessing us in a way that we don't understand because we're looking in a different direction than we should be. And often, I want you to kind of remember this. If you're struggling with something and you're wondering how God has or is blessing me, understand this: when it comes to finding and realizing the blessings in your life, it's better to look in the rearview mirror than through the windshield. Because when you look back, you can see all the times God has blessed you. Sometimes you're driving, and you know what it's like to drive here in the mornings. You can't see 5 feet in front of you. And sometimes that's what life is like to go through. So here's a follow-up question to that. Why has God blessed you? Okay, if you can say God has, actually that slide's wrong, but the second question is why has God blessed you? Okay, why has God blessed you? Jim, that was my fault on the slide there. Okay. I fixed it, but I fixed it after I gave you the slides. So the second question is not what you just saw. The second question is, why has God blessed you? Why has God blessed you? Again, sometimes you need a reminder to look beyond what you can currently see. It is so easy to get stuck and caught in what's immediately around us. And if you're there right now and you're thinking, man, is this just for me? We have all been there, okay? Don't feel like it's unique to you and that God's picking on you. We have all been there. If I asked for a show of hands, I'm guessing everybody would raise your hand that sometimes you're like, man, this is awful right now. That's life. That's life. What you can see right now in your life is not an accurate depiction or accurate explanation of God's blessings in your life. Understand that. And so here's what you need to understand. Again, go back to what we said earlier. The church, we are the continuation of what Jesus started on this earth. As the Father sent him, he sent us, right? So when we think about that, what are we called to do? Again, we are called to be the hope of the world, to bring hope to the world. One of the ways Jesus was sent was to bring life and bring it to the full. We can bring life to the full to others. So sometimes maybe you can look around at what God has given you, and you might be comparing it to your neighbors or comparing it to everybody else, and you're like, man, I don't have as much as he does. And maybe if you're honest with yourself, you can sit here and go, you know what? Maybe it's not my needs that God really has in mind. Maybe God has blessed me beyond what I need. And if you're honest, you can look around and go, I have a lot more than I actually need. And there's some other people that could use this. There's some other people that could use my time, my energy, my money, my resources. I think that God has blessed you more than you realize, not just to indulge you personally, but so that you can bless others. Here's the third question. I think you've already seen it. How have you blessed God? How have you blessed God? Malachi Chapter 1, we read this verse. A son honors his father and a servant his master. I always kind of chuckle a little bit at verses like this. Because when you think about this, how can a son truly honor his father and a servant his master when everything that son or that servant has came from the father or the master? And we think about this, when my kids give me something, I gave it to them to begin with, right? They don't have anything that they've just gone out and bought all on their own. So parents, think about this. When your kids were little especially, now if your kids are grown, this has changed, but when your kids were little, how could your kids do something to you that was truly an honor to you? My kids like to make things and bring them to me. And again, it's kind of funny because, it's kind of like when you and your spouse get each other presents. And it's like, well, I kind of bought that myself anyway, kind of thing. And for your kids, that's kind of the way it is. It's like, well, yeah, I got that for you, and you're giving it back to me. But that's not the point. The point is what they put into it. If you can come up to my office, you see all sorts of things that my kids have colored or created. Amelie made this little monster face thing the other day, and she was so overjoyed to give it to me. Just bubbling up. She was so excited for me to have it. So why is that special? Because she put something into it. Because she cared enough about me to make this for me. Now, to be honest, I think the person she wanted to give it to, she couldn't find, and I was next. But, I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt on this, right? Let me ask you this question. Do you ever find yourself misusing your blessings? Do you ever find yourself indulging personally rather than helping others? Okay, do you ever find yourself just hoarding what you have as opposed to helping other people? Here's how this ties to the church. I'm not going to rabbit trail this. I want to tie this to the church. We look in the Old Testament, and Abraham gave an example of giving 10% of what he had to God. Okay, he gave 10% of his blessing, and that's kind of become the staple of tithing, is that we give 10%. You're not going to find that in the New Testament. You're not going to find Jesus saying give 10%. But Abraham did that, and then Moses put it into law, and that's kind of been the staple that the church has held on to for years, giving 10% of what you have and what you make to the church. But here's the honest truth, okay? Most church research data across the country shows that most Christians, again, those church members who call themselves a member of a church, who are here on a regular basis, give somewhere between 2 and 4%. Again, it's about priorities, okay? We give somewhere between 2 and 4%. A lot of folks tend to give when they go, or when it's convenient, or when they have a little extra. Again, they haven't prioritized it. I know some of you work in tax offices or accounting offices. Okay, here in a few months when tax season rolls around, I stroll in there and go, you know what, I'm just going to pay like 5% this year. Probably not going to end very well for me if I do that. Imagine if our teachers decided to just start giving effort when they cared. Okay? Imagine if our police and firefighters just started responding to things when they wanted to. Not every time there was a call. Okay, imagine if just businesses across the country only gave effort a few percent of the time when they really wanted to. I know a lot of you maybe go shop at certain stores or eat at certain restaurants, and if the staff there starts just being very kind of laid back about things, you're probably not going to go there very much anymore. I'm bringing your food when I'm ready. You're probably not going to go back to that restaurant, right? See, here's the thing, folks. A lot of times we tend to give to the church when it's easy or comfortable. And I want you to understand something. When it comes to talking about money in the church, again, some of us just kind of cringe a little bit. We tighten up a little bit. But you know what Jesus talked about more than almost anything else? Money. He talked about money. Why? Because he knew what money does to people. He knew how it grabs a hold of us, and that outside of our kids and our spouses and our immediate families, our finances are probably the most important things in our lives. And let's be honest, we have to have them to survive. We have bills to pay. We all do. You got to buy groceries. You got to buy gas in your car. You've got to buy these things to survive. But he knew, too, that money could control us if we didn't control it. And that money could grip our heart. That's why he says things like where your treasure is, there's your heart. Not where your heart is, there's your treasure. where your treasure is, there's your heart. See, I think it's easy for us to look around and be like, you know what, the church is doing okay. You know, they've made it through this rough patch we had recently, made it through. We're doing all right. You know why we got in the rough patch? Because people stopped giving. I mean, it's as plain and simple as that. We looked at our numbers, and what we were down last year in terms of what we got into a deficit on was almost exactly equal to what people, like how much our giving dropped. And what a lot of people told me, this is not, I understand, this is not me picking, this is not me stepping on toes or pointing fingers. A lot of people told me, I just quit giving. I just got out of the habit of doing it. And I mean, it was amazing to see kind of that look on people's faces and in their hearts. You could just see kind of the regret that, like, man, I'm so sorry this happened. Here's what I want you to understand. When you hear a voice saying, I think the church will be okay this month if I don't give, that is a lie from the enemy. This is not me saying, hey, give us everything you've got. No, this is me saying, hey, God wants your heart. He wants your heart, because if he has your heart, he's got everything. And when he has your heart, you're not going to have any problem being generous with it. But we had too many folks just say, I think we'll be okay if I peel back and not prioritize this for a couple of months. And folks, that can become a bad habit that is so hard to break. That is so hard to break. Again, go back to that statement. Where your treasure is, there's your heart. In other words, we could kind of say it like this. What we value the most is what we invest in the most. What you value the most is what you're going to invest in the most. So again, go back to what we said earlier. I want you to understand this principle over and over and over. The local church is the hope of the world. If you understand that, if you believe that, if you value that, folks, that's where your investment should go. The church is the greatest organization in the world. And an investment in this may not return on you financially, but it's going to return in terms of the growth of the kingdom, in terms of souls coming to Jesus all across our world. If you value people's lives, if you see people turning and running from God, and you value that Great Commission statement that we're supposed to go into all the world and baptize people and bring them to Jesus, if you pray for lives to turn to Jesus, for people to experience the gospel in their own lives, you understand the church is the hope of the world. And you understand it's worth the investment. I want to kind of share something with you a little bit as we kind of wrap this up. Because I want to kind of let you in a little bit on why we value tithing, why Jennifer and I do this. And this is not because the Bible tells us so. This is why it's important to us. 3 main reasons why. Here's the first one. Tithing builds a stronger faith in our marriage. You may say, well, that's just church talk. That's just pastor talk. No, I honestly believe this. Tithing builds a stronger faith in our marriage. What causes more stress and strain in marriage than anything else? Money. Finances. Okay, you see more stress and more strain, more marriages start to break down because of money than anything else. Because why? It can cause trust issues, can cause cracks in the marriage. We don't argue about money. That's not to say that we don't ever have tension when it comes to money. We do, just like anybody else. But at the end of the day, we don't argue about it. We have our ideas of what, I think we should spend some on and what she thinks we should spend some on. Again, just like anybody else. But at the very start of our marriage, we both understood tithing came first. We both understood that. And so that's never been a question and an issue for us. See, what we understood was that God can do more with 90% of our income than we can do with 100% of it. God can bless it more than we can take care of that 100 on our own. Here's the second reason. Tithing allows my kids an opportunity to see my faith in action. Okay? It allows our kids to see this. Right now, they're still a little bit too young. Elsie has started understanding giving a little bit. But I want you to understand something about how tithing works. Sure, I learned about tithing in Sunday school. But you know who taught me the most about tithing? My mom. And this wasn't even when I was a kid. This was when I was like 20. My mom was going through a divorce. She was going back to school. And some of you have heard me say this. She was going back to school. In fact, we were going to college together. And there was one year I worked part-time and made more money than she did, part-time at a gas station. And she did she was meticulous on her budget, and she saw down to it, to the dollar, I'm not making this up, her income met what she had to pay except for her tithe. To the dollar. And she's like, man, this is just going to be tight. And my grandpa, man with an incredibly wise 6th grade education, growing up in southwest Missouri, said, well, I guess you know what you got to do. You pay that tithe first and let God take care of the rest. She goes, well, it doesn't make sense. He goes, that's not the point. You trust God. So every month, the tithe check came out first, and every month, she had enough. Didn't make sense, did it? But God can do more with that 90%. That changed my life more than anything else I've ever heard or read about tithing. And I know some of you, I've heard your stories. You've got very similar stories. You've got very similar stories about God stretching that and doing things that don't make sense. And here's the third reason it dovetails into that. I believe God wants to do something special. God will do more than you can imagine on your own. You think God needs your money? He doesn't need our money. I mean, he's God. He spoke the world into existence. He doesn't need our money. He wants your heart. I said last week that serving gives us the chance and the invitation to become part of the kingdom, become part of the ministry. I think giving does the same thing. Because God is going to do something special, and he's going to invite you in to be a part of it. And it might not make sense to you because God's plans never make sense, at least to me. They never work on my timing. They never work the way I think they should work, but they're always perfect. Why? Because it's God. And because God's perfect. So that's our idea today. How are you going to plan to give? Here's a glimpse of how Jennifer and I made a plan. We decided this a few years ago. I was challenged by listening to Rick Warren. Rick Warren wrote, The Purpose-Driven Life, pastor of Saddleback Church, one of the biggest churches in America. One of the ultimate celebrity pastors who is one of the most humble people you could ever meet. And what we decided after listening to him talk was this, that every single year, we're going to increase our giving. We made that commitment. And we've been running on this about 3 years now. And some years we can't increase it very much. Okay? Some years we can't, bump it up very much. Some years maybe it's 1%. Maybe it's 0.5%. Some years God's been really good to us and we bump it up, a couple percent. But we want to increase our giving every month. Now, I've heard so many stories about people who give over half of what they get. And God's blessed them. Now, hear what I'm saying. I'm not telling you that when you give more, God's just going to blow up your income. I'm not saying that. Okay? We don't believe that. There are some churches that preach that. I think that is heretical. Okay? Increasing your giving does not mean God's going to blow up your bank account and you're going to get to go, live your best life now. Okay? But God will bless you. And again, sometimes his blessings don't always look like blessings, but God will bless you. The second thing Jennifer and I decided that we wanted to do is, however we are capable and able, we want to help outside organizations. Jen's got a heart for mission. She spent a couple years on the mission fields. She's got friends all over the world. She's working a side business to try and make extra cash to send to them when we can. So again, sometimes we can't send very much. Sometimes we can. But trying to help those who are on the ground, bringing the gospel to places that are very hostile to the gospel. That's it. I mean, that's it. We don't have this big, long, elaborate plan. We prioritize tithing. It comes first. We increase as much as we can each year. Why? Because we've seen what the gospel has done to our lives. And even though the two of us grew up in the church, we've still seen the impact of the gospel in our own lives. We've seen the impact of the local church in our own lives. We've seen the impact of the church across this world. So here's the takeaway for you today. It's simple, and at the same time it's not simple, but here it is. Come up with a plan. Make a plan to financially support the church you love. If God's blessed you in ways that exceed what you think that you need, it's not your needs that he has in mind. So that's it. If you believe that the church is the hope of the world, if you love the church, find a way to financially support it. Make it a priority. And my challenge to you as we kind of wrap this series up is that wherever you're at, you find a way to take that next step. You find a way to take that step forward. Maybe you've been doing like 3 out of these 5. Okay, pick one and make that your next step. Work on that one. Maybe you're doing all 5. Like, how can I continue to take steps? You bring more people in here and teach them how to take these steps. You become a coach. You lead them on that path. You walk with them, guiding them, showing them who Jesus is. Let's pray. Father, we are thankful for him. God, we're thankful for the challenge. God, the challenge to give more. Because, God, we know that sometimes that's tough to hear. That's hard to hear. But, God, remind us it's not about our finances. It's about our heart. It's about giving our heart to you. And, God, we need to understand, too, that no matter how much we give, we can never, ever outgive you. We never will be able to outgive you. That's not what it's about. But, God, this church, God, as you have given us this mission to go out into this area to win people to Jesus, to be your witnesses here, God, to continue the work that you started, Lord, you would allow us to share that burden, that desire, God, to make this a priority. God, to fully engage in your church and in your kingdom. God, I'm personally thankful that you give us challenges that aren't easy. You give us challenges that are uncomfortable. Because, God, that's the only way that we're going to grow to become more like you. So, God, we pray today in Jesus' name. Amen.